The International Slavery Museum takes place in the Merseyside Maritime Museum. From this visit, I've learned how millions of Africans were forced into slavery, the crucial part that Liverpool played in these processes, and how there are permanent consequences for people living all around the world. It was written on the museum's wall that this story has been neglected by too many for too long. The living conditions in the slave ships were horrible. The so-called Middle Passage voyage was a deadly voyage during which 10 to 15% of the enslaved Africans died because of disease, brutality, and suicide. The food portion was very limited and meagre, and the slaves were confined in very cramped conditions. Arriving to most often America, slaves were branded with a branding iron so that their owners could identify them. It showed the processes of dehumanization. Slaves worked to death from sunrise to sunset, and were divided against each other. Indeed, the manager selected an African to drive the gang. He was called the driver and used a whip to force them all to keep pace. Whenever enslaved Africans were caught trying to escape, or worked too slowly, their ears and legs were dropped off. But the tasks weren't the same everywhere. Slaves mostly cultivated sugar, coffee, tobacco, cocoa, indigo, and rice, and did manual, skilled, and domestic tasks. But in some parts of the world, they would work in diamond mines, textile industry, or gold fields. I've also learned that the abolition of slavery happened thanks to lots of people, thanks to great persons, but also thanks to the slave revolts and individual resistance. Indeed, great people defended this cause. Granville Sharp, one of the first English campaigners for the abolition of the slave trade, said in 1769, "A toleration of slavery is, in effect, a toleration of inhumanity." Frederick Douglass, leader of the abolitionist movement after his escape from slavery, said in 1847, "Slavery is one of those monsters of darkness to whom the light of truth is death." And Martin Luther King, leader in the African American civil rights movement, said in 1963, "Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressor." He called for resistance. In addition to those famous people, slaves themselves did resist. They organized revolts and rebellions. They created committees to run away and eventually committed group suicide rather than surrender. But slaves also acted individually, by working slowly, pretending to be sick, stealing, breaking machinery, and spoiling jobs. In Liverpool, lots of streets are named according to slavery. This is the case of the famous Penny Lane. It was probably named after James Penny, who made 11 voyages as a captain in the slave trade. He was made a freeman of the borough of Liverpool after speaking in favor of the slave trade at the parliamentary inquiry. Moreover, Liverpool was a major slaving port, and its ships and merchants dominated the transatlantic slave trade in the second half of the 18th century. And still nowadays, slavery still exists. Indeed, it is more diverse and entrenched than it ever was before. This was said by Gloria Steinem, an American feminist and journalist, in 2006. And there are still sequels for the African Americans and for their families. Here are the words of an 11 boy talking about slavery. His tone is precious, his voice is precious, and his speech is precious.
Because it's true, passion to like personality and always need to do to believe terrible have other way to do what we do. If I was a slave, I would travel daily, with Aisha, who is titled Abuse Day and bring my personal comfort zone to and abuse